The Revolution of Dignity, also known as the Maidan Revolution or the Ukrainian Revolution, took place in Ukraine in February 2014 at the end of the Euromaidan protests, when deadly clashes between protesters and the security forces in the Ukrainian capital Kyiv culminated in the ousting of elected President Viktor Yanukovych, the overthrow of the Ukrainian government, and the outbreak of the Russo-Ukrainian War. In November 2013, a wave of large-scale protests erupted in response to President Yanukovych's sudden decision not to sign a political association and free trade agreement with the European Union, instead choosing closer ties to Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union. In February of that year, the Verkhovna Rada had overwhelmingly approved finalizing the agreement with the EU. Russia had put pressure on Ukraine to reject it. These protests continued for months, their scope widened, with calls for the resignation of Yanukovych and the Azarov government. Protesters opposed what they saw as widespread government corruption and abuse of power, the influence of oligarchs, police brutality, and violation of human rights in Ukraine. Repressive anti-protest laws fueled further anger. A large, barricaded protest camp occupied Independence Square in central Kyiv throughout the Maidan uprising. In January and February 2014, clashes in Kyiv between protesters and Berkut Special Riot Police resulted in the deaths of 108 protesters and 13 police officers, and the wounding of many others. The first protesters were killed in fierce clashes with police on Hrushevskoho Street on 1922 January. Following this, protesters occupied government buildings throughout the country. The deadliest clashes were on 18-20 February, which saw the most severe violence in Ukraine since it regained independence. Thousands of protesters advanced towards parliament, led by activists with shields and helmets, and were fired on by police snipers. On February 21, an agreement between President Yanukovych and the leaders of the parliamentary opposition was signed that called for the formation of an interim unity government, constitutional reforms, and early elections. The following day, police withdrew from central Kyiv, which came under effective control of the protesters. Yanukovych fled the city. That day, the Ukrainian parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from office by 328 to 0. Yanukovych alleged that this vote was illegal and possibly coerced, and asked Russia for help. Russia considered the overthrow of Yanukovych to be an illegal coup, and did not recognize the interim government. Immediately after, the Russo-Ukrainian War erupted, with a Russian military intervention, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, and the eruption of pro-Russian unrest throughout Ukraine, especially in the southern and eastern regions of the country. During the pro-Russian unrest, widespread protests, both for and against the revolution, occurred in eastern and southern Ukraine, where Yanukovych previously received strong support in the 2010 presidential election. Pro-Maidan and anti-Maidan rallies soon clashed with each other and escalated into violence, such as the 2014 Odessa clashes, with the violence at its worst in the Russian-speaking Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian separatists seized control of government buildings and proclaimed the creation of self-proclaimed breakaway states in Donetsk and Luhansk, sparking the Donbas War. Eventually, by 2022, the Russo-Ukrainian War culminated with Russia initiating a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The interim government, led by Arseniy Yatsenyuk, signed the EU Association Agreement and disbanded the Berkut. Petro Poroshenko became president after a victory in the 2014 presidential elections. The new government restored the 2004 amendments to the Ukrainian constitution that had been controversially repealed as unconstitutional in 2010, and initiated a removal of civil servants associated with the overthrown regime. There was also a widespread decommunization of the country. Prelude. Successive Ukrainian governments in the 2000s sought a closer relationship with the European Union. The government of President Viktor Yanukovych had been negotiating an association agreement with the European Union since 2012. Such comprehensive trade agreement with the EU would have impacted Ukraine's trade agreements with Russia, the latter being Ukraine's biggest trade partner at the time. Yanukovych believed that the complications could be addressed, and he said that he intended to enter the agreement, but continued to postpone. This was interpreted as an attempt to back out of signing this agreement, and led to a wave of protests which came to be known as the Euromaidan movement. Protests originally erupted in November 2013 after Yanukovych refused to sign the association agreement with the EU at a meeting of the Eastern Partnership in Vilnius, Lithuania, choosing closer ties with Russia instead. Prime Minister Mykola Azarov had asked for €20 billion in loans and aid. The EU was willing to offer €610 million in loans, but Russia was willing to offer $15 billion, as well as cheaper gas prices. In addition, the EU demanded major changes to Ukraine's regulations and laws, but Russia did not stipulate regulatory or legal adjustment of such nature or scale. Russia also applied economic pressure on Ukraine and launched a propaganda campaign against the EU deal. Yanukovych was widely disliked in Ukraine's west but had some support in the east, where his native Russian is much more spoken, and in the south. The rallies were initially peaceful but became violent in January 2014 after Parliament, dominated by Yanukovych's supporters, passed laws intended to repress the protests. The European Union and the United States urged Yanukovych to negotiate a peaceful end to the conflict and said they would impose sanctions on government officials if they were found responsible for violence. In the lead-up to the February Revolution, an amnesty agreement was made with protesters wherein they would be spared criminal charges in exchange for leaving occupied buildings. The demonstrators vacated all occupied regional state administration buildings, and activists in Kyiv left the Hrushevskoho Street standoff. Kyiv's city hall was also released back to government control on February 16. All those previously jailed for taking part in protests were scheduled to be released after 17 February. On February 14, Yanukovych had said, "I want to say that I was incited, and I'm incited to use various methods and ways how to settle the situation, but I want to say I don't want to be at war. I don't want any decisions made using such a radical way." He called on all politicians to refrain from radicalism and to understand that there is a line that shouldn't be crossed, and this line is law. Overview. The protests that began on the night of November 21, 2013 with public protests in Maidan Nezalezhnosti in Kyiv were still ongoing by mid-February 2014. The protests were sparked by the Ukrainian government's decision to suspend the signing of an association agreement with the European Union. A period of relative calm in the anti-government demonstrations in Kyiv ended abruptly on February 18, 2014. When protesters and police clashed. At least 82 people were killed over the next few days, including 13 policemen. More than 1,100 people were injured. On February 18, some 20,000 Euromaidan protesters advanced on the Verkhovna Rada in support of restoring the Constitution of Ukraine to its 2004 form, which had been repealed by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine shortly after Yanukovych was elected president in 2010. The police blocked their path. The confrontation turned violent. The BBC, citing correspondents, reported that each side blamed the other. The police fired guns with both rubber bullets and, later, live ammunition, while also using tear gas and flash grenades in an attempt to repel thousands of demonstrators. The protesters fought with crude weapons, firearms, and improvised explosives, and broke into the headquarters of the Party of Regions. Police officers stormed the main protest camp on Maidan Nezalezhnosti and overran parts of the square. The trade unions building, which served as the Euromaidan headquarters, was burned down. Political commentators suggested that Ukraine was on the brink of a civil war. Some areas, including Lviv Oblast, declared themselves politically independent of the central government. Starting on February 18, Euromaidan activists occupied regional state administration buildings in several oblasts. On February 19, the authorities instituted police checkpoints, restrictions on public transportation, and school closures in Kyiv, which the media referred to as a de facto state of emergency. On February 20, Internal Affairs Minister Vitaly Zakharchenko announced that he had signed a decree authorizing the use of live ammunition against protesters. Central Kyiv saw the worst violence yet, and the death toll in 48 hours of clashes rose to at least 77. In response, the chairman of the Ukrainian parliament, Volodymyr Rybak, announced the next day that he had signed a parliamentary decree condemning the use of force and urging all institutions to cease immediately all military actions against protesters. Parliament also suspended Zakharchenko from his duties. On February 21, President Yanukovych signed a compromise deal with opposition leaders. It promised constitutional changes to restore certain powers to parliament and called for early elections to be held by December. Despite the agreement, thousands continued to protest in central Kyiv, and the demonstrators took full control of the city's government district, the parliament building, the president's administration quarters, the cabinet, and the interior ministry. On February 21, a bill to remove Yanukovych was introduced in parliament. On the same day, Yanukovych left for Kharkiv. On February 22, the protesters were reported to be in control of Kyiv, and Yanukovych was said to have fled the capital for eastern Ukraine. The parliament voted 328-0 in favor of removing Yanukovych from office and scheduled new presidential elections for 25 May. Parliament named its chairman, Alexander Turchinov, as interim president on February 23. A warrant for the arrest of Yanukovych was issued by the new government on February 24. Over the next few days, Russian nationalist politicians and activists organized rallies in Crimea and urged Russia to help defend the region from advancing fascists from the rest of Ukraine. Detailed timeline. February 18, 2014. On February 18 at 1600 hours, the Kyiv metro stopped all service because of a terrorist threat. Initial clashes. Raid on Party of Regions office and police retaliation. Advance toward Maidan. Breach of Hrushevskoho Street barricade. Attack on Maidan. Opposition leaders meeting with President Yanukovych. February 19. The Kyiv metro was closed and main roads blocked by police. Bigger stores and malls on Kreshchatyk were also closed, but according to a Euronews correspondent, life away from the barricades is business as usual. In the early morning, Titushky shot 2 protesters, killing 1. By this point, the death toll had risen to 26 on both sides, including 10 police. The Security Service of Ukraine launched an anti-terrorist operation, while the intelligence services began investigating unnamed politicians over what was described as an illegal attempt to seize power. The decision to begin the anti-terrorist operation involved the SBU, the Interior Ministry, the Ministry of Defense, the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, and the central and local governments, according to a statement on the SBU website. According to political analyst Taras Berezovets, the decree meant that the SBU could search protesters, seize their property, and detain them at will, without a court order or other legal safeguards. In the early morning, Olena Lukash announced that the opposition had refused to sign a declaration disapproving of radical measures. President Yanukovych demanded that the opposition stop occupying buildings and seizing arms. The opposition, however, would not concede. The acting Minister of Defense, Pavlo Lebedev, acknowledged that he had sent some airborne troops from Dnipropetrovsk to Kyiv. Ciphered telegrams were discovered in which Yuri Ilyin, the newly appointed chief of the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, gave direct orders to deploy military units. Also on February 19, a military An-26 made a secret flight from Kyiv to Russia to pick up a large batch of anti-riot weapons and ammunition. This only became known in 2015. A Euronews correspondent on Independence Square reported that protesters were arriving from all parts of Ukraine. By 1450, about 5,000 remained on the square. Right sector occupied the Kyiv Central Post Office and the State Committee for Television and Radio, with the post office serving as a new headquarters. President Yanukovych fired the chief of the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Volodymyr Zyemana, and replaced him with Ilyin, who was previously the commander of the Ukrainian Navy. The Ministry of Defense announced that it was redeploying units around the country to guard military facilities. The director of the SBU, Alexander Yakhymenko, said that military bases and arms depots had been attacked in several regions. The European Investment Bank froze activities in Ukraine, saying, "For the time being, the situation is so cruel that it would be politically the wrong signal, but also irresponsible vis-a-vis the people we ask to do the job, to be active on business in Ukraine." Following a meeting between government and opposition leaders late at night, both sides declared a truce and agreed to start negotiations. President Yanukovych said in a statement that he had agreed to start negotiations with the aim of ending bloodshed and stabilizing the situation in the state in the interests of social peace. According to opposition politician Yatsenyuk, the truce included a pledge from Yanukovych not to launch a police assault that night. Right sector did not agree to the truce. A Euronews correspondent on Independence Square reported that the number of protesters had grown, saying, "In general, all I have heard from people is the more they are attacked and the worse they are beaten, the more determined they are to stand back up and resume the struggle." February 20. At 12:35, Interfax reported that Yanukovych had declared February 20 a day of mourning for those killed in the clashes. Around 3:50, activists claimed that they had torn a shoulder patch from the uniform of a Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs soldier during the clashes, brandishing the patch as alleged proof of Russian involvement. Protesters at Independence Square continued to hear gunshots, despite the ceasefire agreement. Around 4:20, 5 buses carrying protesters from Ivano-Frankivsk arrived. Each side blamed the other for igniting the deadly conflict. Yakhymenko blamed Ukraine's current Euromaidan government, claiming they were responsible for hiring snipers on February 20. In a statement, the presidential administration of Ukraine claimed that the protesters had gone on the offensive. They are working in organized groups. They are using firearms, including sniper rifles. They are shooting to kill, it said. Protesters accused the police of starting the conflict by throwing Molotov cocktails and improvised explosive devices. Opposition politician Klitschko issued a statement saying, "Armed thugs have been let loose in the streets to attack people and create an illusion that there is a confrontation between citizens." At 9:25, protesters pushed the Berkut back to the October Palace after security forces tried to set fire to Kyiv Conservatory, which was being used as a field hospital for wounded protesters. At 9:32, it was announced that Parliament would not convene. Euromaidan protesters marched on the police with shields and Molotov cocktails and forced them to retreat, thus regaining control of Independence Square and capturing up to 67 police officers. Around 10:49, law enforcement personnel were captured while sleeping in the Ukrainian house and during clashes on barricades near the October Palace. Many of the men were only 18 or 19 years old, were not trained, and were armed only with rubber truncheons. Those with minor injuries were treated by medics. The captured police were from Crimea, the central eastern cities Dnipropetrovsk and Kryvyi, and eastern Luhansk. Interior troops soldiers, of whom almost 100 surrendered during the clashes, were held prisoner at the headquarters of the Energy Company of Ukraine and at the October Palace. At 10 o'clock, between 10,000 and 20,000 demonstrators remained, according to the Kyiv Post, and at least 42 people had been killed, primarily by police gunfire. According to a Union correspondent, there were more than 30,000 people on Independence Square. At 10:55, the chief of the presidential administration, Andriy Klyuev, announced that the president was prepared to sign a treaty with the opposition on the demanded changes to the constitution of Ukraine, and that the ongoing clashes should compel politicians to find a quick consensus. At 10 o'clock, Euromaidan's activists picketed the main office at the Kyiv metro station Polytechnic Institute, demanding that the system be reopened. A former head of the Kyiv city-state administration, Ivan Salyi, also called for the reopening of the metro. At 1600 hours that day, the Titushki were transported by metro from the Pozniaky station to the Pecherska station, Lvivska Gazeta reported. The government also closed highways and railway access. Trains between Kyiv and Lviv, one of the protesters' strongholds, were temporarily suspended. A railway spokeswoman said this was because of damage to the lines. Coincidentally, there were reports that arms had been seized from an Interior Ministry armory in Lviv and transported to the outskirts of Kyiv. The head of the Kyiv city-state administration, Volodymyr Makyenko, resigned from the Party of Regions but said that he would continue to perform his duties to ensure that the city functioned properly. He then ordered the reopening of the Kyiv metro. By 1500 hours, the metro was still not running, and ground-based transport in the city was scarce. The metro was partly reopened in the early evening, but interchange stations remained closed. The Embassy of the United Kingdom in Kyiv was temporarily closed. Radio Liberty published video footage of police special forces shooting protesters with Kalashnikov and sniper rifles. Acting Interior Minister Zakharchenko announced that combat weapons had been provided to the police, saying in an address to the nation, "We signed relevant orders as part of the anti-terrorist center's work. The law enforcement officials have been provided with combat weapons, and they will be used in line with the law on police." The ministry's website said the riot police had the right to use their weapons to free hostages being held by protesters. The ministry further stated that a sniper had injured 20 of its police officers. Interfax Ukraine reported that at 1500 hours, a group of unknown individuals headed to the presidential administration building, and shots and explosions were heard. The Euromaidan self-defense force had repeatedly urged protesters not to go outside the square's perimeter. Diplomatic efforts. Ukrainian political developments. February 21. The Armed Forces Deputy Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Yuri Duminsky, resigned because he disagreed with the involvement of the army in the conflict. Today the army is being involved in the civil conflict, which could lead to the mass deaths of civilians and soldiers, he said. At around midnight, journalist Artem Shevchenko, referring to his sources in the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, announced that 10 BTRs had departed from Kozachia Bay, where the Black Sea Fleet of Russia is based, escorted by DI vehicles. According to Shevchenko, 1,500 airborne soldiers and 400 Marines including the 25th Airborne Brigade, the 1st Marine Brigade, the 831st Anti-Sabotage Unit, and the 2nd Marine Spetsnaz had been transferred on February 20 under the command of the SBU for the anti-terrorist operation. In the lead-up to the day's parliamentary session, it was reported that many members of the Party of Regions and their families had fled the capital, including Acting Interior Minister Zakharchenko and Prosecutor General Viktor Pshynka. Later, Maidan activists released the Interior Troops servicemen whom they had captured the previous day. Meanwhile, the entire police force of Radekiv joined the protesters in Kyiv. The Security Service of Ukraine officially ended its preparations for anti-terrorist operation introduced on February 19. Agreement on settlement of political crisis. Agreement aftermath. Removal of Yanukovych. On February 21, President Yanukovych and Parliament declared 22 and February 23 to be days of mourning due to the loss of human life as a result of mass disturbances. Parliament Chairman Volodymyr Rybak submitted his resignation in Parliament on February 22, citing illness. Yanukovych's whereabouts were unknown, despite media reports that he had flown to Kharkiv. Alexander Turchinov said that most of the ministers had disappeared, including Interior Minister Zakharchenko, who was reported to have fled to Belarus. In the afternoon, the Rada voted 328-0 to remove Yanukovych from his post and to schedule a presidential election for May 25. This vote did not follow the impeachment process specified by the Ukrainian constitution, which would have involved formally charging Yanukovych with a crime, a review of the charge by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, and a 3/4 majority vote, at least 338 votes in favor in Parliament. Instead, Parliament declared that Yanukovych withdrew from his duties in an unconstitutional manner and cited circumstances of extreme urgency as the reason for early elections. Lawmakers then elected opposition leader Alexander Turchinov to be the chairman of Parliament, acting president, and prime minister of Ukraine. This decision also violated the constitution, according to which the impeached president was to be succeeded by the Prime Minister Serhiy Arbuzov. Turchinov claimed that Yanukovych had agreed to resign as president, but after consulting with advisors, he disavowed that and even pre-recorded a resignation statement. Yanukovych said he would not resign or leave the country and called Parliament's decisions illegal. He added, "The events witnessed by our country and the whole world are an example of a coup d'état," and compared them to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s. Disappearance and prosecution. Aftermath and new government. On February 22, 2014, Yulia Tymoshenko was released from prison and addressed more than 100,000 people on Independence Square. The same day, Parliament appointed Arsen Avakov as acting interior minister. Lawmakers also ousted Viktor Pshintsa as general prosecutor of Ukraine in a no-confidence vote. On February 23, the second day of national mourning, Parliament voted to abolish the law on language policies that had given the Russian, Romanian, and Hungarian languages the official status of regional languages in some areas. However, this measure was later vetoed by the acting president, who said he would not sign the bill until new legislation protecting minority languages was developed. The same day, Parliament dismissed Foreign Minister Leonid Kozera, Health Minister Raisa Bogadarova, and Education Minister Dmytro Tabashnik, and nationalized Yanukovych's private estate Mezhirya. Warrants were issued for former Incomes Minister Alexander Klimenko and former Prosecutor General Pshintsa. Parliament also passed amendments restoring its power to appoint and dismiss judges, which had belonged to the Supreme Council of Justice. Kyiv Metro became fully operational again, including the reopening of the Maidan Nezalezhnosti station, on 24 February. On February 24, Parliament dismissed Social Policies Minister Natalia Korolovska and Culture Minister Leonid Novokotko. It also dismissed Ihor Sorkin as governor of the National Bank of Ukraine and replaced him with Stepan Kubiv. The same day, it appointed Valentin Nalyvaichenko as head of the Security Service of Ukraine after dismissing Oleksandr Yakymenko from the post. Meanwhile, the leader of the Party of Regions faction, Alexander Yefremov, declared that the party was moving into the opposition. 77 of its MPs had left the faction over the past few days. On Tuesday, February 25, acting President Turchinov called for the formation of a national unity government by Thursday. Also on the 25th, Anatoly Ikinak and 32 other deputies, mostly former Party of Regions members, created the Economic Development faction. On February 26, Turchinov assumed the duties of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. On February 27, 2014, the first Yatsenyuk government headed by Arseny Yatsenyuk was formed. The cabinet was formed as a coalition of the parties Batkivshchina, UDAR, and Svoboda and the parliamentary factions Economic Development and Sovereign European Ukraine and other independent MPs. Juridical developments. On February 24, Parliament decided to release all political prisoners, including the father and son in the Pavlyuchenko criminal case, and terminated the powers of 5 judges of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, appointed from Parliament's quota, for violating their oath. Lawmakers also offered to dismiss, for the same reason, 2 judges appointed by the President of Ukraine, and called on the Council of Judges of Ukraine to convene an extraordinary Congress within 3 days to consider dismissing 5 Constitutional Court judges appointed by the Council. In the same resolution, Parliament assigned the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to begin criminal proceedings against all judges who, in the opinion of the People's Deputies of Ukraine, were guilty of adopting on September 30, 2010 a decision of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine on the procedure of introducing constitutional amendments. On February 27, judges of the Constitutional Court sent a letter to European organizations, international organizations, and human rights institutions questioning the constitutionality of the parliamentary resolution. On February 27, Yanukovych was accused of having stolen $70 billion from the state budget. The Security Service of Ukraine arrested the former chief of its counterintelligence service, Volodymyr Byk. On July 3, 2014, former Prime Minister Mykola Azarov was placed on the international wanted list for alleged abuse of power. Yanukovych press conference and Russian response. On February 28, Yanukovych attended a press conference in southern Russia and answered questions from mostly Russian reporters. He said that the early presidential elections scheduled for late May were illegal and that he would not be participating in them. He also said that while February 21 agreement could have calmed the situation, the opposition had not agreed to it. Russia considered the overthrow of Yanukovych to be an illegal coup and did not recognize the interim government. On March 1, Russia's parliament approved a request from President Vladimir Putin to deploy Russian troops to Ukraine. On March 24, 2014, Putin stated, referring to the 2014 Ukrainian presidential election, "We will respect the choice of the Ukrainian people and will be working with the authorities formed on the basis of this election." Ban on Russian state TV. On March 11, 2014, the Ukrainian National Council for TV and Radio Broadcasting instructed all cable operators to stop transmitting a number of Russian channels, including the international versions of the main state-controlled stations Rossiya 1, Channel 1, and NTV, as well as Rossiya 24. Lust Russian. On February 26, Edgar Sobolev was nominated to lead the Committee on Lust Ration in the new Yatsenyuk government. Months later, on August 14, 2014, Parliament adopted a bill that established procedures for conducting checks of government officials and people nominated for government position with the purpose of deciding whether they meet certain criteria for occupying relevant posts. The law on Lust Ration, which excluded from government most officials who had worked in the Yanukovych administration, affected up to 1 million people. Volodymyr Yavorsky of the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group called it unreasonable and a serious, systematic violations of human rights among other reasons, because it meant too many people would lose their jobs, including officials who could not be easily replaced. Berkut dissolved. On February 25, Acting Interior Minister Avakov signed a decree dissolving the Berkut. In March, Russia announced that the Crimean Berkut unit would preserve its name as it was incorporated into the Russian Interior Ministry. Protests against the new government. According to Kathy Young, in the anti-Maidan protests against the revolution, street posters, internet posts, and even speeches at rallies attacked the new government as a Jewish clique seeking to use Ukrainians to defend the interests of wealthy Jews, and depicted the revolution as a Zionist coup. Southern and Eastern Ukraine. Crimea. Destruction of Soviet monuments. The monument to the Russian Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov was demolished in the city of Brody in western Ukraine. The militant group Right Sector was blamed for much of the destruction. In addition, a statue honoring Soviet soldiers was removed from the western Ukrainian city of Stryyi. In early December 2013, unknown activists partially painted in red and black a statue honoring the workers of the Arsenal factory in Kyiv who died in 1918. On February 28, a monument dedicated to Soviet forces who fought in World War II and one dedicated to Soviet soldiers who fought in Afghanistan, both in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, were vandalized and painted with nationalistic slogans. On its English-language Twitter account, the Russian Foreign Ministry described the targeting of Russian and Soviet-built monuments as Russophobic vandalism and an outrage, and demanded that it be stopped. Economic. In May 2014, the International Monetary Fund disbursed $3.2 billion to stabilize Ukraine. The European Union required Ukraine to secure this aid package from the IMF in order to obtain about €1.6 billion pledged under the recently signed Ukraine-EU Association Agreement. Sports. On February 19, 2014, UEFA announced that it had decided to change the venue of the 2013-14 UEFA Europa League round of 32 match between Dynamo Kyiv and Valencia from Olympic Stadium in Kyiv to GSP Stadium, in Nicosia, Cyprus, because of the riots in Kyiv. Dynamo Kyiv and the other clubs competing in the round of 32 held a minute of silence for the victims in Kyiv before the match, and the athletes played wearing mourning armbands. On February 25, subsequent games of the 2013-14 Ukrainian Basketball Super League were postponed. On February 26, the second part of the 2013-14 Ukrainian Premier League was suspended because of the situation in the country. On March 3, a scheduled friendly match between the United States and Ukraine in Kharkiv was moved to Nicosia because of safety concerns regarding potential instability in Kharkiv Oblast. 3 HC Donbass home KHL playoff games were moved from Donetsk's Druzhba Arena to Slovnaft Arena in Bratislava, Slovakia. After playing Game 7 of their first-round series against Dinamo Riga and Games 3 and 4 in the second round against Lech Praha in Bratislava, the Slovak capital, the team returned to Donetsk for the sixth game of the series against Lech. Public opinion. A December 2016 survey by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology found that 34% of respondents in the government-controlled Ukraine regarded the change in power as an illegal armed coup, while 56% regarded it as a popular revolution. Signing of the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement. The first Yatsenyuk government signed on March 21, 2014 the European Union-Ukraine Association Agreement with the DFTA to be signed after the presidential election in May 2014. Suicides of former officials. After Euromaidan, 8 former officials tied to Yanukovych's Party of Regions were found to have committed suicide. When Newsweek in summer 2015 approached the General Prosecutor's Office about the deaths, the office initially replied that all information about them was a state secret. The prosecutor's office later said that 4 of the deaths were being investigated as murders. A suspect was also charged with murder in a 5th case, the death of prosecutor Sergei Melnichuk. Casualties. After the first day of clashes, 26 people were reported dead, 16 protesters and 10 police officers. Those hospitalized included 3 minors, 5 journalists, and 79 police officers. According to Olga Bogomolets, an honored doctor of Ukraine, snipers were aiming at heart, lungs, and neck. Deaths. From 18 to February 19, the official death toll according to the Ministry of Healthcare was 28, of whom 10 were police and Berkut troops. By 1300 hours on February 20, at least 34 more protesters had been fatally shot by the police, with reporters verifying the bodies. In the early afternoon, Kyiv Post journalists reported a further 8 bodies on Kreshchatyk Street. According to the coordinator of medical services on Independence Square, Oli Musi, between 70 and 100 protesters had been killed by 1730 on February 20. Meanwhile, the Kyiv City State Administration reported 67 deaths based on the number of bodies delivered to forensics. The Ministry of Healthcare reported 75 deaths since the start of the conflict. Speculation on snipers. CNN reported that officials had intercepted a telephone call between Foreign Minister Ms. Pete of Estonia and High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy Catherine Ashton, in which Pete relayed a doctor's testimony that the sniper killings of protesters and Berkut troops had been committed by the same people. Pete later asserted that he had not been implying that the opposition was involved, but merely relaying the content of the doctor's testimony. Olga Bogomolets, the doctor who allegedly claimed that protesters and Berkut troops had come under fire from the same source, said that she had not made such a claim to Mr. Pete, that she had not implied that the opposition was involved in the killings, and that the government had informed her that an investigation was underway. Hennady Moskal, a former deputy head of Ukraine's main security agency, the SBU, and of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, suggested in an interview published in the Ukrainian newspaper Zerkalo Tizna that snipers from the Missing in Action and SBU, not foreign agents, were responsible for the shootings and had acted on contingency plans dating back to Soviet times. He said, in addition to this, snipers received orders to shoot not only protesters, but also police forces. This was all done in order to escalate the conflict, in order to justify the police operation to clear Maidan. He further suggested that the current Minister of Internal Affairs, Avakov, and the chairman of the SBU, Nalyvaichenko, were protecting the personnel who actually planned and carried out the killings, in order to prevent backlash against the ministry and to avoid a loss of prestige. Avakov said that the conflict had been provoked by a non-Ukrainian third party and that an investigation was ongoing. On March 31, 2014, the Daily Beast published photos and videos showing that the snipers were members of the SBU's anti-terrorist Alpha unit who had been trained in Russia. The media suggested that it was not the Ukrainian riot police who fired on the protesters, as previously believed, although the members of the Alpha team are Ukrainian citizens. Ukrainian mass medias reported the results of forensic examinations, according to which, the government police Berkut was implicated in the murders of Maidan protesters since, according to these forensic examinations, matches were found between the bullets extracted from the bodies of Maidan protesters and the weapons of the government police Berkut. The experts explained why no match between the bullets and the weapons, which had been assigned to the Berkut Special Force, had been found as a result of the examination of the bullets held in January 2015, whereas the examination carried out in December of the same year had showed such a match. Foreign involvement. Russian involvement. The perception that Yanukovych was trying to establish closer ties with Russia played a major role in the protests. Yanukovych accepted bailout money $2 billion out of a $15 billion package from Russia, and this was interpreted as a sign that he would seek close ties with Putin. Russian officials had been pressuring the Ukrainian administration to take decisive action to crush the protests, and the police assault on Euromaidan protesters was ordered hours after the $2 billion from Russia was transferred. Several government ministers from across Europe blamed Russia for exacerbating the violence. In an interview on February 20, a retired colonel of the main intelligence directorate of Russia, Alexander Musyenko, said that the conflict could only be solved by force, and that Ukraine had proven it could not exist as an independent, sovereign state. According to government documents released by Ukrainian former Deputy Interior Minister Gennady Moskal, Russian officials served as advisors to the operations against protesters. Codenamed Wave and Boomerang, the operations involved the use of snipers to disperse crowds and capture the protesters' headquarters in the House of Trade Unions. Before some police officers defected, the plans included the deployment of 22,000 combined security troops in Kyiv. According to the documents, the former first deputy of the Russian GRU stayed at the Kyiv hotel, played a major role in the preparations, and was paid by the security services of Ukraine. According to Reuters, the authenticity of the documents could not be confirmed. Interior Minister Arsen Avakov said that the conflict had been provoked by a non-Ukrainian third party and that an investigation was ongoing. On February 21, after a failed crackdown that killed as many as 100 people, Yanukovych made some concessions. In response, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev of Russia said that Yanukovych needed to stop behaving like a doormat, and that further loan installments would be withheld. A Russian political advisor, Sergei Markov, said, "Russia will do everything allowable by law to stop from coming to power." On February 24, Russia's foreign ministry issued a statement urging Ukrainians to crack down on the extremists who are trying to get established in power, and Medvedev refused to recognize Ukraine's provisional government as legitimate. During a press conference on April 3, 2014, Ukraine's new interior minister, chief prosecutor, and top security chief implicated more than 30 Russian Federal Security Service agents in the crackdown on protesters, saying that, in addition to taking part in the planning, the agents had flown shipments of large quantities of explosives into an airport near Kyiv. Valentin Nalyvaichenko, the interim head of the Security Service of Ukraine, said the agents had been stationed in Kyiv throughout the Euromaidan protests, had been provided with state telecommunications while residing at an SBU compound, and had kept in regular contact with Ukrainian security officials. "We have substantiated grounds to consider that these very groups which were located at an SBU training ground took part in the planning and execution of activities of this so-called anti-terrorist operation," Nalyvaichenko said. Investigators, he added, had established that Yanukovych's SBU chief, Alexander Yakhimenko, who later fled the country, had received reports from FSB agents stationed in Ukraine, and that Yakhimenko had held several briefings with the agents. The FSB rejected these claims as groundless accusations and otherwise refused to comment.